Hi, I'm Isolde, and 5 years ago, I watched my fiancé call off our wedding, grab my sister's hand, and walk away, while my parents clapped like it was a Broadway finale. They called me a disgrace, a cheap replacement. And I stood there, silent, pregnant, forgotten, humiliated. They erased me. But now, my son just called the man they all hate Dad, and you should have seen their faces. Ever wondered how silence can become the sharpest revenge? Stick around. You're about to find out. They said Charleston in spring was a dream. Dogwoods blooming, warm breezes off the harbor, sunlight filtered through moss-draped oaks. But all I remember is the taste of copper in my mouth and how the bouquet trembled in my hands like it knew before I did. My dress was ivory satin, fitted at the waist, flaring out in soft pleats just like my mother wanted. Everything that day was what she wanted, except maybe me. I stood at the back of the hall, arm hooked around my father's, staring down the long aisle lined with white chairs and curated smiles. 300 guests, cameras, laughter, and somewhere at the end of that polished aisle stood Caius. I whispered to myself, "Just breathe, Isolde. Smile." But even the mirror that morning hadn't smiled back. The music swelled. The doors opened. My heels clicked slowly over the hardwood as people turned to look. No one gasped. No one cried tears of joy. They just watched. Like it was theater, and I was the understudy no one believed in. Caius stood tall at the altar in a black tailored suit, expression unreadable. Maricela was beside my mother in a champagne gown that hugged her perfectly. Her hand rested lightly on Mom's arm, both their faces poised like porcelain. I reached the altar, heart thudding so hard I felt it in my throat. Then Caius stepped forward, but instead of taking my hand, he grabbed the bouquet. My bouquet, and dropped it right there on the floor. The petals scattered in every direction like something breaking, so soft, so violent. A few gasps came from the guests. I didn't move. Neither did he. He looked at me, lips curled in something too cruel to be called a smile. "You were never supposed to be the bride, Isolde." Silence. My chest rose and fell, tight with confusion, but I held my ground. My mother didn't flinch. My father blinked but didn't speak. It was Maricela who stepped forward, heels clicking like a verdict. Caius reached for her hand, and she gave it to him. "As of today," he said, voice raised to reach the far ends of the hall, "I'm with the woman I was meant to marry, not some cheap replacement." My ears rang. Someone coughed, someone laughed, nervously, and then the sound I'll never forget. Applause, polite, steady, controlled, from my parents. They clapped, not slow, not hesitant, just proud. I felt something inside me snap, not loudly, not with fireworks, but like a seam quietly coming undone. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I looked at each of them, my throat raw with a scream I refused to give them. And in that stretched, awful silence, time folded in on itself. I was 7 again, standing at the piano recital where Maricela had messed up the final chord. Yet Mom ran up to her, hugged her, told her she was brilliant. I was 11, winning my first spelling bee, only to hear Dad say, "That's nice, sweetie, but your sister made cheer captain." 100 little moments where I'd swallowed myself down to make space for them. And now this. I stared at Caius, at the man who had whispered promises in the dark, who'd kissed my forehead after dinners, who once cried when I told him I loved him. I saw nothing left of that man now, only cold calculation and performance. I turned. No rush, no stumble. The train of my gown swept over the petals. My heels echoed as I walked down that aisle alone. Guests parted, but no one touched me. No one dared. The doors slammed behind me. Outside, the rain had started, as if Charleston itself wanted to wash the day away. It soaked through my hair, down my spine, turned my dress to lead. Still, I kept walking, across the gravel, past the manicured hedges, through the wrought iron gate that never seemed as far away as it did now. My breath came shallow, but I didn't collapse. I didn't scream. I just whispered, "This is the last time I let them define me." And yet, as the rain soaked my dress, I realized I had nowhere to go but away. I didn't look back, not once, as I stepped off that plantation lawn and into the cab I'd called with shaking fingers. The rain streaked the windows like a smear of everything I couldn't say aloud, and for the first time in my life, I didn't leave a note. No explanation, no goodbyes, just silence. A week later, I found myself in a one-bedroom rental in Atlanta. The walls were bare, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the only furniture was a mattress on the floor and a thrift store lamp that hummed like it had secrets. I sat cross-legged, still in the oversized sweatshirt I'd borrowed from a stranger's lost-and-found box at the bus depot. My dress, my wedding dress, had been left in a hotel trash bag, soaked and sagging like an old promise. The rain hadn't stopped. It tapped on the glass now, softer but steady, like it had followed me here. And in that small room, with no familiar smell, no comforting voices, I heard it again. Not the rain, but the applause. 300 people, all watching. Not a single one said, "Wait, what the hell is happening?" Just claps, polite, even approving. And my parents, oh God, my mother with that little upward nod as if to say, "See, that's how it should be." My father's hands moved slowly, like he was closing a deal. There wasn't even a flicker of hesitation. My ears burned just thinking about it. I leaned my forehead against the cold window pane. I wanted to believe I had run away from that moment, but truthfully, it had come with me. Every breath I took still tasted like betrayal. And then, it hit me. Not just that they clapped, but why it hurt so damn much. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. When I was 12, I won first place in a regional essay contest. I'd written about grief, about what it felt like to lose our childhood dog, Toby. It was raw and quiet and honest. My English teacher cried reading it. The school principal asked me to read it aloud at the spring assembly. I came home with the certificate clutched to my chest, thinking maybe this, finally, would be the thing that got them to see me. Mom glanced at it, then said, "That's sweet. Maricela just got invited to the governor's youth council." Dad didn't even look up from his newspaper. Later that week, I overheard them in the kitchen. My mother was making coffee. She said it so casually, it didn't even sound cruel. "She's only here because we couldn't have another girl back then. God works in strange ways, huh?" And my father had chuckled. They called me their little bonus, but what they really meant was, "You're the backup plan that stuck." Now, Caius had just said it louder. "Cheap replacement." A phrase rehearsed in whispers and glances my entire life had finally made it to center stage. I dropped my head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. The cracks there looked like veins, dry and permanent. That morning, I'd tried to apply for jobs. Something to get me moving, anything to distract from the noise in my head. But my fingers kept freezing above the keyboard. What do you write when the only story you know is how you weren't wanted? My phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again. Finally, I picked it up. A voicemail. From my mother. Of course. I almost deleted it without listening, but something made me press play. Her voice was soft, sugary, the way someone speaks when they think they're educating you. "Sweetheart, it was for the best. Maricela is simply more fitting. She and Caius, they make sense. You'll understand when you're older. You'll thank us someday." She paused, then added, "The applause wasn't about hurting you. It was about celebrating the right daughter finally taking the stage." I didn't cry. I laughed. One short, sharp exhale of disbelief. They weren't even sorry, not confused, not ashamed. They were proud. I tossed the phone across the mattress and stared at it like it might come alive and strangle me. They didn't just choose her, they erased me and clapped. I stood up. The mirror on the back of the bathroom door was cracked, probably from the last tenant. The line ran diagonally across my reflection, splitting my face in two. I touched it, almost afraid the glass would give way. I'd thought about disappearing, about changing my name, bleaching my hair, getting as far away as my savings would take me. But if I did that, their version would win. Their story, the one where I was too weak, too plain, too nothing, would be the only one people remembered. No, not like this. I still had shame clinging to me like smoke. But under it, deeper, was something else. Not anger. Not yet. A flicker. A tiny spark of resolve. They think I'll fade. They think I'll break. But I've watched them lie with smiles my entire life. I can lie too. But mine will be strategy. One day they'll regret clapping. I didn't know then that the chance to prove them wrong would arrive sooner than I ever imagined. It started with a letter. 2 months had passed since the wedding. I'd gotten a job waiting tables at a diner off I-75, working the late shifts, cash under the table. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the rent. The days bled together, sleep, work, microwave meals. I didn't keep in touch with anyone. Not that anyone was trying to keep in touch with me. One Wednesday morning, I came home after a double shift. My feet were killing me, and I dropped my keys into the cracked ceramic bowl near the door. A small pile of unopened mail sat on the windowsill, most of it junk, ads, coupons, a past-due notice from the electric company, but one envelope stood out. Heavy cream paper, cursive handwriting. I hadn't seen since high school graduation, Maricela. I stared at it for a long minute. My fingers hovered over the seal. I should have thrown it away. I should have burned it. But I opened it anyway. Inside were 3 glossy photographs. Her and Caius, no, Donovan now, I forced myself to say it, posing like royalty at the exact same venue I'd booked for our wedding. My venue. My flowers. Even the string quartet I'd selected. She wore the same shade of ivory I had chosen. The smugness on her face in each photo felt choreographed, rehearsed. Underneath the last photo was a note in her looping script. You were just the rehearsal. I'm the show. And scribbled at the bottom in Donovan's messy handwriting. Hope you've moved on. Cheap replacement. I didn't even realize I was shaking until the photos slipped from my hand and scattered across the floor. My breath caught, a short, ugly sound like a hiccup smothered in shame. My first instinct was to rip the whole thing to pieces, but I didn't. I picked it back up, folded it carefully, and slid it into a shoebox under my bed, right beside the wedding invite I never mailed and the pearl earrings I never wore. Something told me I'd need it later. 2 weeks passed. The nausea started slow. At first I thought it was stress, too much diner food and not enough sleep. But then came the fatigue, the dizzy spells, the aversion to coffee. That one hit me hard. I'd loved coffee since I was 15. I tried to ignore it until one afternoon, while bussing tables, the scent of fried onions made my stomach turn so violently I had to run to the restroom. Back at the apartment, I sat on the edge of the tub, knees pressed together, the pregnancy test box clenched in my fist like it might bite me. I took the test, waited. When the result appeared, I stared at it for a full minute, as if willing it to change. But it didn't. 2 pink lines. Pregnant. I laughed. Or cried. Or maybe both. My head hit the tiled wall behind me with a soft thud. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not alone. Not in this place. Not with his child. I imagined the look on Donovan's face if he knew. Or worse, Maricela's. I imagined my mother spinning the news into something poisonous, Another round of condescending, "You'll understand when you're older." My hands shook as I pressed them to my stomach. Nothing showed yet. But I knew. Deep in my bones, I knew. There was life inside me. A flicker. Fragile, yes, but real. At first, I felt the weight of betrayal all over again. How could I carry a part of him after what he did? How could I look at a child and not see the man who humiliated me in front of everyone I knew? But then something shifted. This child wasn't his. Not really. This child was mine. Mine to protect. Mine to raise. Mine to love in a way I was never loved. I wouldn't tell them. Any of them. They didn't get to claim this. Not the parents who clapped at my erasure, not the sister who smiled as she slid a knife into my back, and certainly not the man who called me disposable. This baby wasn't proof of my shame. It was proof I had survived, and I wasn't going to give them a single piece of it. Later that night, I stood in front of the mirror again, the same crack still slashing across my reflection. I looked older now, tired, maybe, but steadier. I placed my hand over my belly and whispered to the life within me, "They'll never own you." Not like they owned me. I thought silence would keep us safe, but silence has a way of drawing predators closer. It invites them in, makes them bold enough to knock. I was 7 months along when the knock came. That afternoon, the apartment smelled like baby powder and lavender dryer sheets. I'd just finished folding the last of the onesies I'd picked up at the church thrift shop. The living room looked like a pastel battlefield, soft pinks, creams, and faded yellows stacked neatly across the futon. There was something about secondhand clothes that made them feel more real, like stories had already been lived in them. I imagined my daughter one day asking where her favorite blanket came from, and I'd smile and tell her it had already comforted someone once. Now it was hers. The knock came again, sharper this time. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came by unannounced. I wiped my hands on my sweatshirt and opened the door halfway, heart nudging against my ribs like a quiet warning. And there they were, Donovan in his tailored slacks and smug half-smile, the same one he wore at the altar before throwing my life away. Maricela standing just behind him, hair slicked into a perfect chignon, arms folded like she had better places to be. "Well, this is cozy," he said, glancing past me into the apartment. "Mind if we come in?" I didn't move. Maricela gave a tight-lipped smile. "We just need a minute." Donovan held out a manila envelope. "It's just paperwork. Nothing dramatic." I stepped back without speaking. Not a gesture of welcome, just distance. They walked in like they still owned something here. I didn't sit, so neither did they. Instead, he laid the envelope on my kitchen counter like it was a gift, not a grenade. "What's this?" I asked. "A waiver," he said. "Just legal stuff to make sure you're not going to come after any family assets. We figured we'd get ahead of things, keep everything clean." "You understand?" Maricela nodded as if we were all adults here, having a reasonable discussion about boundaries. "And why now?" I asked. Donovan's eyes dropped to my stomach. "Because you're showing, and someone out there is going to start asking questions." I stared at the envelope, then back at them. "You knew." He didn't flinch. "Of course I knew." Maricela chimed in, her voice tight and too sweet. "We just thought you'd want to keep this private. You know how people talk." He took a step closer. "Look, Isolde, we're giving you a chance to avoid making this messier than it already is. You sign, and we never bother you again. No court, no headlines, no drama." I hadn't noticed my hand resting over my stomach until the baby kicked. Just a small nudge, but firm. She felt it too, the tension, the threat. "And if I don't sign?" Donovan's smile curved cruel. "Then you'll regret it." I took a deep breath. In the past, that would have broken me. The look, the tone. The implied consequences. But something had changed. Maybe it was the weight of the baby grounding me. Maybe it was the silence I'd sat in for months, building a different kind of strength. I picked up the envelope, skimmed the top page, clean language, legalese dressed up as compassion. They wanted to cut me out quietly. I folded it closed and set it back down. "No," I said. Donovan blinked. "I'm not signing this," I added. My voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "I'm not yours to erase." He laughed like I'd just told a joke at the wrong party. "You think you can raise a child on your own here? In this dump?" Maricela looked away. She didn't speak, but her silence wasn't agreement. It was discomfort. I held Donovan's gaze. "If you think I'm still the girl you left at the altar, you're mistaken." He stepped forward, but I didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said. That got him. Maricela touched his arm. "Donovan." "Let's go." He shook her off but didn't push further. "This isn't over," he muttered. As they turned to leave, he tossed one last parting shot over his shoulder. "If you don't sign, you'll regret it." I stood in the doorway long after they disappeared down the hallway. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with the echo of a moment I didn't run from. I'd always thought silence was surrender. But today, it was my line in the sand. They thought they could scare me into disappearing. But I had something more powerful than fear now. I had something worth protecting. And this was just the beginning. I thought his threats were empty, until the day I nearly lost everything. It started like any other morning. The kettle hummed on the stove, and the apartment windows fogged with condensation. I was folding laundry, tiny shirts and socks that barely covered the palm of my hand, when the mail slid through the slot. I didn't think much of it until I saw the envelope. It was thick, legal. My name typed out in a font too formal to mean anything good. I sat on the edge of the couch, cradling the envelope in my hands for a minute before tearing it open. Inside were pages and pages of legal jargon, but the headline was clear enough: Petition for Prenatal Custody Consideration. It was a motion from Donovan's legal team asking the court to recognize his rights as the unborn child's father. They wanted to establish a framework for custody, even before she was born. My throat went dry. It was one thing for them to knock on my door and try to intimidate me face to face. But this was bigger. It meant they had lawyers. They had a plan. And I was just me. 2 days later, I found myself sitting on a cold plastic bench in the hallway of the Fulton County Courthouse, the documents clutched tightly in my lap. I didn't have a lawyer. I couldn't afford one. Around me, people moved in and out of courtrooms, arguing, laughing, crying. But I sat frozen, alone. I kept rereading one particular section that described me as financially unstable, lacking familial support, and presently incapable of providing a suitable environment for a child of reputable lineage. Reputable lineage. That's what they called Donovan's bloodline. Not mine. The tears didn't come right away. They just built in my chest like a tight coil. By the time I walked back to my car, it felt like I had swallowed a rock. At home, I dropped my purse by the door and collapsed into the armchair. I stared at the same 4 walls that had felt safe just a week ago. Now, they looked smaller, trapped. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining men in suits showing up at the hospital the day I gave birth, signing papers I didn't understand, taking her before I ever got to hold her. I kept thinking, what if they win? What if they actually take her from me? The next morning, I tried calling a legal aid office, but the hold time stretched for hours. Every voice message sounded the same. Leave your name, someone will call back. No one did. By the end of the week, I had started packing. Just the essentials at first. Diapers, baby wipes, a few sets of clothes, I had no clear destination in mind, just away. I told myself it was for the baby, that maybe somewhere quieter, somewhere less connected to the Donovan name, I could give her a life without fear. But truthfully, I was terrified. Running felt like failure, but staying felt like suicide. That night, sitting on the hardwood floor of my bedroom, I stared at the open suitcase. My fingers curled around the zipper, ready to shut it, ready to disappear. Maybe this is the only way, I whispered into the dark. But then I looked around. The crib I built with my own hands still stood by the wall. The baby blanket I spent hours stitching sat draped over the edge. The onesies were still folded in a drawer, waiting. I had worked so hard to create this tiny world. I couldn't leave it behind. And she, this child growing inside me, had already survived so much. My chest heaved as the tears finally came. I sobbed into my palms, trying not to make a sound. It wasn't grief anymore. It was desperation crashing against the last pieces of my will. I curled up beside the crib on the floor, clinging to the only proof that I was still fighting. The effort I had put into building a place for her. I didn't know how I was going to win. I just knew I couldn't vanish. If I did, they'd get exactly what they wanted. They would rewrite the story. As I lay there, eyelids heavy from hours of silent crying, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't want to check it. I didn't think I had the strength for one more blow. But something nudged me. A whisper in the dark. I reached for it and blinked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. They're planning more. Be ready. And I didn't know who sent that message, but it saved me from making the worst mistake of my life. The next morning, I kept replaying those words over and over in my mind. They're planning more. Be ready. I didn't go anywhere unnecessary. I double-checked the locks. I kept my phone charged, turned up loud. And yet, when the attack came, it still caught me off guard. It was a Monday. Early evening. The sky hung low with clouds, swollen and heavy with the threat of rain. I had just left my prenatal checkup 2 blocks from the apartment. My belly ached slightly from the weight of the baby, now so close to coming. I was thinking about dinner, maybe soup, something simple. The crosswalk light turned green. I stepped off the curb. That's when I heard it, the screech of tires, far too fast for a residential street. I turned. A black SUV barreled toward the intersection. It wasn't stopping. No honk, no flashing lights, just speed and intention. Time didn't slow like people say. It sharpened. My breath caught. I stumbled backward, falling hard on the sidewalk just as the SUV swerved, narrowly missing me by inches. Then it was gone. No plate I could catch. No driver I could see. I sat there, palms scraped, knees trembling, staring at the road like it might rewind itself and show me something I missed. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't random. I was a warning shot away from a headline. That night, after I finally stopped shaking, I got another message. No number, no name, just a short line. That was only a warning. Sign the papers. I sat there for a long time, phone clenched in my fist. The apartment lights buzzed softly overhead. The crib stood by the window, half assembled. My whole body burned, not just with fear, but fury. Donovan wasn't trying to take me to court anymore. He was trying to scare me into disappearing. And maybe, if he succeeded, no one would ask questions. I'd just vanish. Another woman with no power and no voice. But something shifted in me. I thought about my baby. How one day I'd have to look him in the eye and tell him what I did when the world tried to crush us. If I gave up now, I'd be telling him he came from weakness. I didn't sleep much that week. The paranoia grew. Every knock on the door, every car that slowed near my building, my heart jumped. But I didn't run again. I waited. I listened. I watched. 7 days later, the ally showed up. I had just come back from the corner store, a bag of groceries balanced on one hip. As I neared the stairs, I noticed him. A man in his late 40s, wearing a navy coat too warm for spring and scuffed brown shoes that had seen better days. He wasn't threatening, just waiting. "Isolde," he said, hands raised like I might bolt. I didn't answer. "My name's Malcolm Rayner. I used to work with Donovan, years ago." I stayed quiet. Still outside, still in public. Safe enough, but ready to scream if I had to. "I know what he's doing to you," he continued, "because he did the same to me, just in a different way." I blinked. Why would I believe that? He pulled a folder from his coat. "Because I kept the receipts." I didn't take it. I asked him to leave it on the steps and come no closer. That night, after I double-locked the door, I finally opened the folder. Inside were printed emails, contract drafts, bank transfers. They painted a clear picture. Donovan had laundered money through his family's holdings, manipulated stock options, and thrown Malcolm under the bus when the IRS came sniffing. "I tried to fight it," one email read, "but his father had connections. I lost everything." And he walked away with a promotion. At the back of the folder was a sticky note, in shaky handwriting. "He's scared you'll find out what else he's buried. Don't stop now." I didn't sleep at all that night. But it wasn't fear that kept me up. It was possibility. Maybe I wasn't alone. Maybe someone finally believed me, not because they pitied me, but because they saw the truth. Maybe silence hadn't been cowardice after all. Maybe silence was just me waiting until I had ammunition. The next day, I met Malcolm at a diner 2 neighborhoods over. We sat in a booth by the window, eyes on the parking lot. He wore the same coat. I brought the folder. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked me. "Because if we move, there's no undoing it. And Donovan doesn't forgive." I looked at my hands, at the quiet strength in them I hadn't noticed before. "I don't need him to forgive," I said. "I just need him to fall." Malcolm nodded, then slid another folder across the table, a thicker one. I opened it. Inside, proof that Donovan laundered funds through the very company he claimed I was unfit to inherit. I sat in silence, eyes on the documents, heart slow but pounding. Not from fear this time, but from the still, steady realization that I was no longer the one being hunted. I had a weapon now. I didn't know how I'd use it yet, or when, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't swing too early. I'd wait until the fall was louder. The next morning started like any other. I threw on a jacket that barely zipped over my belly, now nearly full term. My back ached with each step, but I had errands to run. Diapers, bread, more prenatal vitamins, normal things. The grocery store was busy for a Tuesday. As I reached for a jar of peanut butter, I felt it, that shift in the air. People staring. A woman near the fruit display whispered something to her husband, and he glanced straight at me, not just curiosity, recognition. I kept walking, pretending not to notice. But near the dairy aisle, an older woman I vaguely recognized from my building stepped into my path. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice low. "I thought it might not be true. But this?" She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper. She handed it to me like it was something fragile. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The headline screamed in bold, "Socialite Scorned. Inside Isolde Reyes's Dangerous Fantasy Pregnancy." My stomach turned. Not from the baby, but from the words. I scanned the story. Sources close to the family reveal Ms. Reyes has displayed erratic behavior since being left at the altar by fiancé Donovan Prescott. Some suggest she faked her pregnancy to manipulate sympathy and gain access to the Prescott fortune. There was more. "She's always been emotionally unstable," one unnamed source said. "She latched onto Donovan like he was a lifeline. It was sad, really. Desperate." They didn't sign their names, but I didn't have to guess. Maricela and Donovan had left their fingerprints all over it. A photo ran beside the article. Me, walking out of a doctor's office, belly visible, looking tired and worn. Clearly taken without my knowledge. Online comments followed. I glanced at a few on my phone before I had to stop. Typical gold digger. Cheap replacement acting like she's the main act. She's gonna name the baby after herself, watch. My throat tightened. My eyes burned. It felt like the wedding day all over again. Except this time they didn't clap. They laughed. And this time, it wasn't just my family watching. It was everyone. I went home, sat on the couch in silence. I didn't cry. Not then. For a moment, I wanted to fight back immediately. Call the newspaper, post my truth, show the sonogram photos, name names, scream. But I didn't. If I fight on their terms, I whispered, I've already lost. Because that's what they wanted. A screaming woman. A mess. Something to point to and say, see? Told you she was crazy? No, not this time. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is my knife. So I sat still, and I planned. I called Malcolm that evening. They've gone public, I said. I figured they would, he replied. It's their favorite move. Shame the one who knows too much. We met 2 days later, this time at a small library downtown. No one looked twice at us there. He brought more documents, including a timeline of fake invoices Donovan signed personally, right around the time he'd claimed I was too emotionally unstable to attend board meetings. It was lining up, but they were still ahead, for now. That week, the messages on my door started, slipped under, scribbled in permanent marker on a napkin, even scratched lightly into the side of my mailbox. Go away. Nobody wants your lies. Unfit mother equals dangerous child. I kept every single one. Then Maricela showed up. It was a Saturday. Overcast, the sky smudged gray. I was folding baby clothes in the living room when the knock came. I opened the door a few inches. There she stood, perfect hair, glossy lips, eyes full of the same condescension she wore like perfume. She tilted her head like we were old friends. Isolde, you look tired. I said nothing. She glanced behind me, pretending to admire the apartment. Cozy. Must be hard, doing it all alone. But I'm sure it builds character. I stepped aside just enough to block her view of the crib. She clicked her tongue, then leaned in, voice soft but razor-sharp. People are talking. You might want to think about disappearing before this gets worse. It'd be better for everyone, especially the baby. For a moment, my pulse kicked up. But then, just as quickly, it steadied. I looked her right in the eye, and I didn't say a word. Something flickered in her expression, maybe confusion, maybe fear. Then I closed the door. She didn't knock again. I stood with my back against the door for a while after, breathing steady, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was focused. They want a scene. They want a headline. I won't give it to them. I will give them something else. Let them lie louder. Let them dig deeper. Let them smear whatever's left of my name, because when the truth comes out, and it won't just sting, it'll shatter. I walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Rain had started to fall, soft and steady, like a heartbeat. Then I whispered to the quiet room, let them laugh louder. It will echo when it dies. The words settled in me like a vow, and the next morning I woke up with a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in months. Not peace, not exactly, but purpose. The kind that makes your spine straighten without thinking, the kind that lets you hold your chin high even when you know you're walking into a room full of wolves. Charleston was humid when I stepped off the train. The air was thick, the kind that makes you sweat through your clothes before you reach your destination. Malcolm waited near the curb, dressed in a plain navy suit, holding a manila folder like it was something holy. You sure about this? He asked quietly as I approached. I have to be, I said. He nodded. Then let's go. The family estate hadn't changed much since the wedding. Same iron gates, same manicured hedges, same white columns trying too hard to look timeless. But something about it felt smaller now, as if the place had shrunk while I grew. Inside, the great room buzzed with voices. Old investors, distant cousins, board members I hadn't seen since I was a teenager, all dressed in silk and suspicion. I spotted the judge who once held me on her lap during Christmas dinner, and the same man who clapped when Caius humiliated me at the altar. Funny how memories stick to wallpaper. We took our seats. I placed the folder in front of me, flat palms resting on either side. My belly nudged against the table's edge, 7 months along and unapologetic. Then Donovan walked in. He wore a gray suit, perfectly tailored, smugness dripping off him like cologne. Maricela followed behind, lips tight in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Our parents sat already, their expressions unreadable. Mother's hands were folded, white-knuckled. Father avoided my gaze. Donovan took center stage as if born to it. "Thank you all for coming," he began, eyes sweeping the room like he was conducting a performance. "Before we proceed with quarterly matters, I must address a personal concern, one that affects the integrity of this family's business." He reached into his briefcase, pulled out a set of documents, and raised them like a magician about to reveal a trick. "These," he said, voice thick with false gravity, "are financial records that point to significant discrepancies, embezzlement to be precise. Traced back to Mrs. Older-Reyes, they show she diverted funds while employed by our accounting team years ago." A wave of murmurs broke out. Someone near the fireplace gasped. I didn't move. Donovan continued. "This isn't about revenge or past relationships. It's about protecting our legacy from instability and manipulation. I ask that the board take appropriate action to disassociate from her entirely." He smiled then, not with his mouth, but with his eyes, like he already thought he'd won. And for a moment, it might have looked like he had. I let the silence stretch. Let their eyes burn into me. Let the room lean forward in anticipation. Then I stood. "I expected this," I said, voice calm, even warm. "In fact, I hoped you'd do it in public." Donovan's smile twitched. I lifted my folder and handed Malcolm a small remote. With a click, a screen descended from the ceiling, and the projector lit up. Slide after slide flashed, real bank transfers, records of shell corporations, dates aligning perfectly with Donovan's signatures. "This," I said, turning to face the room, "is where the real money went. Not through me, through a network Donovan built to siphon company assets for personal gain." I tapped the next slide. "And this," I pointed, "this signature here, it's the same flourish he used on the fake documents accusing me. A handwriting expert confirmed it. He forged everything." The room turned colder than the air conditioner allowed. "He called me a cheap replacement," I said, eyes never leaving his. "But it turns out he was the counterfeit all along." The silence snapped. Gasps, whispers. A woman near the back covered her mouth. One of the older shareholders stood up, asking to see the evidence up close. Maricela's face had gone sheet white. My mother blinked rapidly as if trying to piece together two versions of the same daughter. My father just looked tired. Donovan opened his mouth, probably to lie again, but Malcolm cut him off. "Speak carefully," he said. "The next words out of your mouth could cost you what little freedom you have left." Donovan froze. I gathered the papers into my folder, slow and methodical. I didn't rush, didn't falter. "I was never going to play by your rules," I said, loud enough for every soul in the room to hear. "And now, I don't have to." I turned to leave, but paused at the door. Looked him in the eye. "This is over, and so are you." The words rang louder in my own head than they did in that grand, silent room, but I meant every syllable. As I stepped out into the Charleston sun that afternoon, the heaviness I'd carried for months, maybe even years, finally began to lift. It didn't vanish. Grief doesn't work that way. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't dragging my feet through someone else's version of my life. 3 weeks later, I sat on the hard wooden bench outside the Charleston courthouse. The paint on the trim was fresh, but the air still held the must of old justice and older money. I was early, on purpose. I wanted to see him one last time, not out of spite, but to remember what it looked like when the truth caught up. The security doors buzzed open. 2 uniformed officers flanked Donovan, each gripping an elbow. His once crisp suit looked crumpled and greasy, like a mask coming loose. His hair, perfectly parted the last time I saw him, was unkempt, and his eyes darted around, still searching for a camera to smile at, or maybe a loophole to crawl through. But there weren't any left. Maricela stood off to the side, barely recognizable behind her oversized sunglasses. She didn't speak, didn't wave. Her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to hold herself together from the inside out. For all the years she pretended to be the poised one, she looked more lost than I'd ever seen her. Our parents weren't there, they hadn't reached out. No calls, no letters, just silence. And oddly, I was fine with it. There's a kind of mourning that happens when you stop wishing someone would choose you. It's not sudden, it's not loud. It's the quiet death of hope. And sometimes, that's what healing needs. I watched Donovan get loaded into the van, cuffed and defeated. The irony didn't escape me, how easily he fell apart without the power to script the story. And for years, he'd been the author. Today, he was just another name on a docket. Back home, the living room smelled faintly of lavender and warm oatmeal cookies. My son, my heart, was sprawled on a blanket in the sunlight, laughing at nothing and everything all at once. He had Donovan's eyes. I couldn't pretend he didn't, but they were softer somehow, like they hadn't learned cruelty yet. He reached for me as I stepped inside, those tiny hands curling in the air, trusting without question. I scooped him up and kissed his cheek. "You are not his," I whispered. "You are mine. You are free." That night, after he fell asleep, I stayed beside his crib longer than usual, just watching, his little chest rising and falling, the corners of his mouth twitching in dreams. The mobile spun slowly overhead, casting soft shadows on the wall. I used to fear those shadows. Now I let them dance. Weeks passed, and the world didn't end. I still got mail. The sun still rose. I still struggled with bills, but I also slept through the night sometimes. I laughed. I started writing again, just small things. Journals, letters I never intended to send. Words had once been weapons in Donovan's mouth. Now they were mine to wield gently, like balm. One afternoon, I took my son to the local park, the kind with rusty swings and wood chips that somehow end up in every shoe. He toddled toward the sandbox, plopped down, and started making piles like they were masterpieces. A woman nearby looked over and smiled. "He's adorable," she said. "How old?" 14 months, I replied. She tilted her head. "He looks just like you." I smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "People used to call me a cheap replacement," I said softly, almost to myself. But he's proof I was always the original. I didn't flinch as I said it, didn't choke on the words or taste bitterness. They weren't barbs anymore. They were armor. And in that moment, I knew I'd never be erased again. Later that night, I folded laundry in the quiet hum of the living room. Onesies, socks too tiny to believe. I paused with a burp cloth in my hand, suddenly realizing how far I'd come and how much I'd let go. I still had scars, not all of them visible. There were moments I caught myself checking over my shoulder or bracing for a betrayal that wasn't coming. But that was okay. Scars don't mean you're broken. They mean you survived. I never reconciled with my parents. I didn't force forgiveness. I didn't beg for belonging. Some wounds are best left closed. And family, I learned, isn't defined by blood or by names etched on letterhead. It's in the people who stay. The ones who stand beside you when everything else falls away. Malcolm stopped by sometimes. He never stayed long, but he always brought something. A box of diapers, a meal, a kind word. We didn't speak of revenge anymore. Only beginnings. I looked at the blank journal on my table, still untouched since the day I bought it. The cover was navy blue, simple. On the inside, I finally wrote something. Silence isn't emptiness. It's space. Space I've filled with my own voice, my own truth, and my own child. And as I closed it, I thought about the girl I was. The one who stood quietly in white lace while the world laughed. The one who cried behind thrift store curtains, afraid of a knock at the door. The one who nearly ran, but stayed. They erased me once, but I rewrote myself. Would you have done the same?